Hello neighbor, I'm Robert Burns, and I trust that you very much enjoyed the most recent feature we did with regard to the attorneys Art Smith and Brian Dijon, and the problematic behavior in which those two gentlemen engaged themselves, and what I believe is going to be some very obvious problems that will cause in the upcoming trial of Troy Hebert for civil liability involving Brett Tingle. Obviously we will update you on that as that trial starts to approach, and whether or not Art Smith will in fact be allowed to continue as the counsel of record for Mr. Tingle. The more I've looked at that, the more I believe that the judge may be very well inclined to dismiss Art Smith. I mean, that conduct was just absolutely egregious. And so I think there's a very real possibility that Mr. Smith will find himself no longer quarterbacking that team, but obviously that will be up for Judge John DeGravels to make the decision on that. But at any rate, whether he does proceed or doesn't, we will certainly attend that trial, and we will let you know how that turns out. You may have noticed in today's feature, once again, we're kind of on the subject of Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, because the title of today's feature is that Murphy Painter, who was Troy Hebert's predecessor in that position, and whom, rather than go into a lengthy discussion about Murphy Painter, I'm going to give you a link for a feature that I did with Stephen Street when he appeared at the Baton Rouge Press Club in January of 2017. During that episode, Mr. Street chose to label me as Exhibit A, and I'm quoting him. But that will give you a fairly thorough background on both Murphy Painter and Corey Delahousse. So in the interest of time for this video, I'm not going to go into all the history of Murphy Painter, but I would certainly encourage you to take a look at that post. Of course, many of you will also remember that most recently here in the last, 3 weeks or so, I did an extensive feature on Stephen Street and his past history of problems with tax liens and occupational licensing liens, and quite frankly, he never should have been qualified to sit in the position that he's in, because he is a pure 100% lackey for whoever sits in the governor's mansion. And that is not, let me emphasize something to you with regard to the current arguments that are taking place about whether or not his office has search warrant authority. I can tell you right now that an agency that reports directly to the governor, and you will see on that feature that I linked in January of 2017 just how sensitive Mr. Street is about questioning along those lines, because that's what that feature was all about. And the reality is, he's not going to give you an honest answer. Well, our office is independent, Mr. Burns. No, it's not, okay? And if it was, you would branch off from the governor and not be, you would have an organizational chart that is totally independent of the governor. And the reality is, Stephen Street is very much a lackey of whoever sits in that governor's office. And during the Murphy Painter trial, Al Robert, one of the two defense counsels, outside of the presence of the jury, made one of the most profound quotes, and I know I've repeated it several times, but I think it bears repeating once again. He said, and I'm quoting, talking to U.S. Judge James Brady, who has since passed on and has gone on to be with the Lord, but at that time was presiding over Murphy Painter's case, and he said, and I quote, "Your Honor, this is not the FBI. This is the OIG. These people do not know what they're doing," unquote. And I'm going to very briefly give you a little background. Back at the point that Bobby Jindal was elected governor, he bestowed, or he strongly encouraged, and the legislature went along with bestowing law enforcement agency status upon the Office of Inspector General. And now, as John McClendon has litigated, there's considerable question marks as to whether or not they have search warrant authority. It's not so specified in the statute, and I can tell you right now, I don't like the idea of an agency that reports directly to the governor having that kind of authority. I'm just going to be blunt with you, because it's an open invitation for a governor The governor already has way too much power. No matter who's in that mansion, the governor, in my opinion, has way too much power. It's unlike in any other state. And now we're going to have a lapdog, so-called investigative body that can literally go in there and execute search warrants. And I don't like the fact that the governor can dictate these type investigations. And trust me, that's what happened in Corey Delahousse and Murphy Painter. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And Stephen Street served as a lackey for Jindal in both of those instances. I mean, there is just no easier way to say it. And I attended every court hearing, including the entirety of the Murphy Painter trial. And it was very obvious this was a politically motivated charge, and I mean, it was an unmitigated disaster for the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's something they ought to retain footage of, though we can't have cameras in the courtroom, but it needs to be a lesson in how you do not go about. And I attribute much of the failing of that to the fact that the lead investigatory body was the Office of Inspector General, even though the statute clearly says they cannot be the lead agency. That whenever they uncover reported or wrongdoing or illegalities, they shall turn it over to a full-fledged federal or state law enforcement agency. Well, you know, I have talked to you about Murphy Painter, and I'm going to give you that link so that you can get the full background. But I have repeatedly said this thing has dragged on for 7 years. I'm talking about his civil trial. And approximately 18 hearings. And you know, you can only keep backing somebody up so much before they finally say, to hell with it, I've had enough. And the feature that we had as the headline is that Murphy Painter has now launched the nuclear attack on Stephen Street, and is now they have filed a motion into Judge Janice Clark's courtroom. She is the judge overseeing that, seeking to have the entire law enforcement status of Stephen Street's office declared unconstitutional. We have given you the direct link for the filing. We've also put up the highlighted pages. I'm going to take just a few moments to read off some of those highlights. We'll be brief, and then this video will be over. But it says that this honorable court is being asked to declare the designation of the Louisiana Office of Inspector General as a law enforcement agency unconstitutional as applied by the OIG, Stephen Street, and its employees. And he goes on to say that even if some circumstances were met, then under that interpretation, that the statute would be unconstitutional on its face. You can see that this was filed on April the 2nd at 12:39 p.m. You are getting a stamped copy, which is always my policy. If it has not actually been filed into the record, I don't go forward with it. If you go over to the second page, you'll see the Inspector General shall, and that's in boldface, report complaints of fraud, abuse, and corruption to such federal, state, or local agency when there is evidence of what may be criminal activity, and when otherwise appropriate, shall otherwise cooperate with such agencies in any further action. That's not what happened in Murphy Painter's case. They did it all, okay? So they are not conforming with what the statute says they need to do. And you'll see further down, shall notify the appropriate law enforcement agencies, and then that they may assist. Stephen Street has blatantly violated this, okay? It has been the Wild West with him. We told you about the 6 a.m. raid on Corey Delahousse's home, when it's now not even in dispute. You had no authority whatsoever to even be there, okay? You were not investigating a covered agency. When I tell you this is a loose cannon operation, I mean it is a loose cannon operation. Cites a little further down in the middle of the second page, I have highlighted that they shall not include arrest powers. That was a specific limitation that was put into. This is not a full-blown law enforcement agency. That's one of the reasons, I mean, there's proof of it there. They've restricted, you know, you will not have arrest powers, all right? Skipping down to the bottom of the second page, the OIG, Street, Evans, and Evans claims gave the OIG the authority to apply search warrants If you go over to the next page, it'll say the OIG issued a detailed report regarding its criminal investigation of Murphy Painter, in which it branded Mr. Painter a criminal. Okay? Well, you know, the last time I checked, there is the presumption of innocence. Okay? So this man's never been tried, and they're going to issue a report painting Murphy Painter as a criminal. Okay? I got a real problem with that, and it would be ironic that ultimately when his trial he would be acquitted of every single charge out there. Mr. Painter has never been found guilty of anything. And I will tell you that courtroom trial was a complete, utter, unmitigated disaster. In fact, I was able to indirectly get some word from one of the jurors, not directly, but I talked with somebody who knows a juror on there who said they didn't have blank. You fill in the blank, it starts with an S. I used a lot of profanity in reading off some text from Mr. Brian Dijon in the last feature, so I'll try to make up for it in this one with just using the first letter. It said they didn't have S, fill in the blank. Going further down on paragraph 7, it says that the Inspector General's office, in given these new powers, was still to conform with existing law. Okay? They're not doing that. They're going out there, you know, they've already substantiated. They don't even follow the procedure for the restrictions that were put on them about getting subpoenas, all right? The streets have all said, well, yeah, there's supposed to be a 48-hour wait period as the application is made with the judge. We've just never bothered with doing that. You know, I mean, it's amazing that this gentleman has these federal tax liens, occupational licensing tax liens. He wants to readily admit that, hey, we don't conform with the statute, but he's going to be the one entrusted to go out there and investigate into you for doing, if you happen to be part of a covered agency. And in Delahouse's case, it didn't even matter to him that he wasn't part of a dedicated agency. I'm sorry, a covered agency. Bobby Jindal sicked him on him, and like the good little lackey that he is, he went after him. And that's why you'll see Mr. Street try to trivialize my confronting him on these things by referencing me as Exhibit A. I'll say, Mr. Street, we'll consider this Exhibit B. How about that? I'm Exhibit A, so we'll consider this little filing Exhibit B. All right, let's go on to paragraph 6 on the third page. Well, that's where I said he had been branded a criminal. Go on down to paragraph 8. The OIG, in its own words, now this is when they had the conversion from what they used to being a law enforcement agency. The OIG, in its own words, completely shifted its focus away from its original scope and purpose of conducting civil audits and investigations to conducting criminal investigations. All right, they have admitted we completely changed our focus. All right, and I'm here to tell you they most certainly did. All right, let's go on to paragraph 9. Despite there being no change in the law that requires the OIG to refer matters to the appropriate federal, state, or local law enforcement agency when there is evidence of what may be criminal activity, the OIG, in its own words, quote, completely shifted its focus, unquote, away from its original scope and purpose to conducting criminal investigations on its own. Okay? A little further down, Mr. Painter had been involved in criminal act. It said, although according to the OIG, Inspector General Steed and Shane Evans, they believe within days of beginning their investigation that Mr. Painter had been involved in criminal activity. They did not refer the matter to the appropriate federal, state, or local agency. Instead, the OIG, Street, and Evans proceeded with their own criminal investigation. That doesn't seem very consistent with, you know, serving in the backup role that the legislature told you were to do. Of course, when you fear your job may be on the line and the governor tells you, go get them, guess Street decides these statutes don't really matter. All right? This is Exhibit B, Mr. Street. I'm Exhibit A. Let's go to the bottom of paragraph 10. Talked about confidential information regarding the investigation into Mr. Painter. They made it public, contrary to the provisions of this Louisiana Revised Statute. And in the warrant application, Evans, Street, and the OIG branded Mr. Painter a criminal. Okay? Again, a person is entitled to the presumption of innocence until they are adjudicated guilty in a court of law, and that never happened, okay? And I love the way Stephen Street will go so far out of his way to say, hey, all of our work products are privileged, okay? You know, and you can't see them, you know? But then he can conveniently decide, hey, that's in our advantage to leak out this little deal that, hey, looks like Mr. Painter was a criminal here. It would seem like if we can't see your stuff, keep it all hidden from us, okay? Don't selectively choose when you're going to let us, you know, it needs to be a two-way street, no pun intended. Paragraph 11, the OIG Street and Evans continued the investigation without referring the matter to the appropriate federal, state, or local law enforcement agency as required by the statute to determine whether a criminal investigation was warranted, and if so, for that agency to conduct the criminal investigation. Going to paragraph 12. Street issued a report to the governor, which was immediately made public. That report branded Mr. Painter a criminal, stating that he had, quote, illegally, unquote, accessed information and that his actions appeared to violate state criminal laws. Well, I'm just going to tell you, folks, I mean, I sat through that entire trial, and I'm not kidding you. You know, they showed that he had accessed the system, and he always went to level 1. Now, they said that didn't matter. There was a letter agreement with state police that you weren't to use their database system. Mr. Fowler, with, I believe her name was Starnes from state police, but I don't hold me that was a disastrous witness for the U.S. attorney. I mean, she was a disaster. But when Mr. Fowler, when I say she was a disaster, she literally said, what I want everyone in this room to understand is that you're not to access this system. Okay, so she's done got up high and mighty here. She's going to preach down to everybody, including the judge. What she wants everyone in this room to understand, I'm sure Mike Fowler was just salivating, saying, keep going, honey. We'll give you a little more rope. Hang yourself. You know, and then Mike Fowler put up on the Elmo a statute that literally said that the ATC was to utilize that system. A statute, okay? And he then asked her, he said, would it not be your belief that a statute trumps a letter agreement? She said she didn't know. Okay, like I said, when I tell you this was a fiasco, it was a fiasco, all right? Going on down to paragraph 13, Mr. Painter again painted a criminal, reporting that its investigation revealed that Mr. Painter engaged in, quote, widespread illegal use of confidential law enforcement database. Oh, I forgot to wrap up that. He went into level 1 and he got the addresses of a former lobbyist for the alcohol industry and his brother because their mother had passed away, and he wanted to mail them a sympathy card, okay? He just used it as a convenience at the lowest level, okay? And it was repeatedly demonstrated that he didn't go in here and go into the delving of, there are various levels on this database. And that's when I said the state police, you know, their witness, which was had to be the worst witnesses they had for the prosecution. It doesn't matter what he used it for. You know, Mr. Fowler had said he got nothing more than he could have gotten by simply walking down the street to the local clerk of court's office as I knocked her. Doesn't matter, okay? Well, when you're talking about sending somebody to federal prison for looking up an address to mail a sympathy card, I would submit to you that it does matter, okay? And when Mike Fowler gave the opening instructions to the jury, he said, all I ask of you through this whole trial, and especially when you go into deliberations, is please don't check your common sense out at the door, okay? And I would submit to you that somebody, you know, apparently in some powerful position, because this is so disappointing that the U.S. attorney would engage in this prosecution, because you would think politics wouldn't play a role here. Somebody didn't use common sense, okay, with the U.S. government. Now, I know what the strategy was. It's that, well, we'll just squeeze this man until he doesn't have any more financial resources, and he'll have to agree to a plea. And it didn't work. And I can tell you why it didn't work, but I'm not going to reveal something that was told to me in confidence about Mr. Painter's wherewithal. I'll leave it at that. Because this was one hell of an expensive thing that Mr. Painter had to pay for in that defense. Now, ultimately, we had to pick up the tab, as rightly it should be, because he was acquitted. Never should have. This fiasco never should have happened in the first place. engaged in, quote, widespread illegal use of oh, by the way, James Brady, outside of the presence of the jury, said that rises to the level of a federal offense? I mean, I can't even imagine being in the U.S. Attorney's shoes and having to answer a question like that from a federal judge. Talking about the sympathy cards. According to the report, OIG did not refer the matter to any other appropriate law enforcement agency when it determined that there may be criminal activity or at any other time, instead conducting and completing a criminal investigation itself and then referring its investigation to the U.S. District Attorney and the East Baton Rouge District Attorney. Let's go on to the next page. Whenever there may be criminal activity and that you relegate the role of the OIG to a support role, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. You're not supposed to be in the front seat of this vehicle, okay? And you're not qualified. I'm going to be blunt with you. These people are not qualified. They do not have the necessary training. Go look up the average salary of these OIG investigators, you know. They don't know what they're doing. It's just like Al Robert said, and nor do they get the training because Stephen Street's too busy running all over the country talking about how great he is. And I want to emphasize something. You know, for a long time, Mike Edmondson had a lot of people fooled, okay? And what brought him down? What brought him down? I would remind you it was that he was going to go off to San Diego to get yet another one of these awards in the deceit that's going on all over the nation. And the reality is that award was not even intended for him. It was intended for a trooper named Carl Saison. But Mike Edmondson and that supersized ego of his wasn't going to have it. So he intervened, knocked Saison out. He goes to San Diego to get this award. And guess what? Isn't it ironic that that would all lead to his downfall? Why do I say that? Don't be fooled by Stephen Street running around telling you how great he is, okay, to his own colleagues who aren't going to know any better because they're certainly not following what's going on down here. For sure. I mean, the reality is to have him as the president of that Association of Inspector Generals is just an outright, clearly they don't know, because otherwise they're all idiots. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it. But anyway, there's supposed to be this support role and cooperate with the appropriate agency. Further, the OIG's interpretation that it may apply for and obtain criminal search warrants is inconsistent with the unconditional confidentiality requirements of the law. I think that's going to be a pretty strong argument. Paragraph 18, the OIG can brand someone a criminal in its report. The OID did just that with Murphy Painter. Going to paragraph 19, he talks about another interpretation that would make the statute unconstitutional as applied to Mr. Painter. That's going to pretty well wrap it up. I don't think I've skipped anything major. Obviously, we're going to follow this, but I think it is about time. You know, I have consistently, you know, and I asked Governor Edwards, I'm not going to replay the clip because I played it near the end of the one about, you know, the federal tax liens and all of that. These governors have stood by Stephen Street, and the reason is obvious. They are using him to create the illusion that there's real investigations going on. We have rampant corruption in this state, all right, and yet we've had an inspector general for all these years. Can you think of any prominent, successful prosecution that has ever transpired under the watch of Stephen Street, who has now been in that office for a decade? Rack your brain for a minute. Can you come up with one? I don't think you can, because there are none, okay? I can give you some very high-profile disasters that have happened on his watch. Corey Delahousse comes to mind. Murphy Painter comes to mind. And I'm wagering there's probably going to be a pretty good chance that Nate Kane is going to come to mind. All because Stephen Street either cannot read the statute, and he's not that dumb, okay, or he's going to ignore the statutes because he's fearful of losing his job if he doesn't conform and be the lackey that he is with any sitting governor. I want to applaud the attorneys for Murphy Painter. This is 7 years this has dragged on. Enough is enough. Apparently the legislature is not going to have the gumption to buck the governor for what these things are. which is not very satisfying to me. And hopefully they will. But I would hope that even if the legislature is going to continue to fund the incompetent operations, the renegade operations of this office, that perhaps, and I certainly hope it does, this filing by Murphy Painter may defang these people. Because I can tell you right now, I'm not comfortable with somebody of the caliber of Stephen Street remotely having search warrant authority when he is a total lackey for the governor. The governor already, and by the way, Mr. McClendon was kind enough to say to me he wishes that he had posed the argument about the governor being able to abuse this when he made his arguments at the federal court in Alexandria. I took that as an extreme compliment, particularly given that it's coming from an attorney that I would now have to put in the same select class with Mike Fowler. And Mr. McClendon, if you're watching this, you know that is a tremendous compliment. Hopefully the fact that it comes from Exhibit A, as identified by Stephen Street, won't diminish that compliment. So I truly hope that Murphy Painter prevails in this, because it is time for this renegade operation that is given the false illusion that there are investigations going on to root out corruption in Louisiana, and it is nothing but a farce, okay? If it wasn't, you ought to be able to give me some major case that Stephen Street has prevailed in, and I'm telling you right now, you can't, because it hadn't happened. He doesn't even pursue the major, and I can tell you right now, I've got one, and I really hope the day comes when we can release it. Right now, I have to sit on it, and I can do that, but I'm talking about running interference for the governor of this state and literally stopping dead in its track an investigation of criminal activity, because that is what Stephen Street does. And the reason he does it is because he doesn't have the kind of financial independence that would be needed for someone to say, I'm totally independent. You are most certainly not. And I went into the great lengths of the debts that you have and your past problems with federal tax liens, because you are totally beholden. And that's who Bobby Jindal wanted, okay? And that's who he got, and John Bel Edwards has been equally content to have somebody that is a total lackey. And I am praying that Murphy Painter will succeed in ending this absolute farce that has gone on for over 10 years in the state of Louisiana. This is Robert Burns. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to have a next upcoming feature. I spent the entire day at the legislature today. I'm exhausted, but I will tell you, it's one of the happiest days that I've ever spent out there. I'll let it go at that. We'll have part of that in our next feature. Once again, it's Robert Burns. Thank you so much for the dedication of our many viewers. Thank you again.